Carla, thank you for the introduction. Lee, thank you for the invitation. Very honored to be part of this. I've been hearing all the other panelists, and I feel like there's a lot of echoes between a lot of what everyone is saying. So hopefully I will add um, to that discourse as well. So I'm going to share screen. All right. So I'm Fernando Laposse. I'm a product designer by training. I studied in Central St. Martin's in London, although I am Mexican. And I would describe myself as a material designer of sorts. But I would also consider myself a bit of an artisan. You know, I both design and hand make every single one of my pieces. I mean, now I have a semi-big studio with a lot of helpers, but I am always personally involved in every single piece, both physically and obviously intellectually. And my pieces are very, very labor intensive. I think there's something that really captivates me about craft and about just, you know, how you can really infuse a piece with value by the sheer amount of hours spent on it. I've sort of specialized over the years in looking at traditional fibers and plant fibers. For me, it's an endless source of inspiration because it's you know, a source of materials that is always renewable, that is always regenerative if it's done correctly. It's not extractive, it's not like stone, it's not like metal. You can literally just grow your materials over and over, and I'm really deeply inspired by that. And I also have this sort of fascination with the contrast of the local and the global. And I feel like myself, I sometimes feel like a bit of a translator, and between, you know, the reality of very localized communities and to put it into perspective on a global scale. I also do spend my time in very disparate places, you know, so I currently still have a studio in London. I have a studio in Mexico City, and then I have a third studio in a small village called Tonawixtla. And today's presentation is focused mostly on the work that we've been doing in Tonawixtla over the past almost 9 years now. So Tonawixtla is an indigenous farming community in the state of Puebla on the border with Oaxaca. It's an area called the Mixteca Mountains, is the lower Mixteca. So these are people that are indigenous, that have maintained their traditions, that are still speaking their indigenous language as a first language, as opposed to Spanish. But I feel like it's also very interesting because it's a village that is situated about 80 kilometers away from the oldest archaeological site that evidences the beginnings of corn domestication. So you are really talking about the epicenter of corn. This is where it all started. And, you know, I think what's really interesting is that this is a desert that has been turned into an oasis of food by the domestics. So it just shows you that deep understanding of the local people, of the natural balance and the interconnection of all these natural elements. And that has allowed them to basically grow food where most people wouldn't be able to. And by the way, like corn is basically, when I say this is the beginnings of corn domestication, corn as we know it nowadays, it's a completely man-made plant. It's been transformed from something that looks more like a wheat, just called teosinte, which is the wild corn, into what we have today. And so without the input of men, you wouldn't have modern day corn. And without the discovery or the domestication of corn, you wouldn't have had the great civilizations of central Mexico. So corn is extremely important for our culture. And I'm sure, you know, you all gathered that from previous presentations, but it's good to reiterate it. So I have a personal connection with Tonawixtla as well. I went for the first time when I was 6 years old, and this was thanks to an invitation from Delfino. Delfino is a man that used to work in my dad's bakery, and my mom and dad really trusted him. He became extremely close to the family, and he invited us all to visit his village in 1992, I think, 1993. And that's where I experienced for the first time what Tonawixtla was. For me, it was like going to another planet, because it's where I realized that people from my own country spoke different languages, ate different food, had different beliefs. And I think it's hard for me to explain it to people that don't have this or don't come from countries like this. But I remember I was giving a lecture actually in Reykjavik once, and I was trying to explain to the students in the art academy, there's probably more things in common because of contemporary culture between someone from Mexico City and someone in Iceland than someone from Mexico City and someone that is also Mexican but comes from an indigenous town. It is that disparate, and I think this kind of diversity is what makes my country so rich. And this is something that I noticed from a very young age. Then I was very fascinated from a really young age. And one of the things that really jumped at me as a young child was to see that even the fruits and vegetables that these people ate were completely different from what I had in the city. So, this richness of agriculture is really the heritage of this whole area, which is so important. As a young child, I also discovered, the whole concept of the milpa system, what is called also the Three Holy Sisters, which is an indigenous permaculture technique that ensures soil fertility. It's a multi-crop yield that doesn't need crop rotation or weeding. So it's a really genius system that was developed by Proto-Mesoamericans, because remember, corn is this man-made freak of nature plant that has an abnormal consumption of nitrogen from the soil. So if you don't combine it with other plants that fix nitrogen, such as the beans or the pumpkins, the corn completely decimates the nutrients of the soil. This is something that ancient Mesoamericans discovered, and this has been an uninterrupted agricultural system for 9,000 years. But unfortunately, it is also a system that is at odds with mechanized harvesting. It's completely in opposite philosophies with contemporary mass agriculture. So it is becoming more and more endangered. And we have to think about this, corn is essentially a sacred plant for our indigenous communities in Mexico. But in contrast, in the rest of the world, corn is no longer planted as food. I don't know if you guys knew this, but corn is the most planted grain in the world right now, more than wheat, more than rice, more than anything else, by far. But how many of you eat corn straight from the cob every day? Probably very, very few of you in other countries. And this is because most of the planted grain in the world is planted to produce secondary products like industrial sugar additives, ethanols, biofuels, animal feed for cows, and more recently and more prominently, bioplastics, which I think is the silliest thing ever, to grow food in places where people are starving to turn into a disposable fork. For me, it's just nonsensical. And so you have this sort of two opposing worlds in the world of corn. And those opposing worlds were separate up until this moment, 1994, with the NAFTA free trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. This was a very ambitious economical alliance that was supposed to be bilateral, meaning, it was meant to be equally products flowing in both directions of the border, but in reality, it's been a very unfair exchange in my view, and it completely destabilized the markets, especially at the agricultural markets in Mexico, and so much so that the value of corn dropped to 1/3 of the price from one day to the next, which meant if you wanted to live off exactly what you were making the previous year, you had to produce 3 times more, and the only way to do that was by using chemicals and by abandoning the milpa system. So this is Delfino, the same man you saw in the previous photo. This is about 25 years later. And Delfino has become a community leader in Tonahuixla. And this is a short clip of him explaining this. Let me know if you can hear.
There's no sound, Fernando. Maybe you need to stop share and share again and click the button where it says sound when you do the sharing.
Okay, let me do it again. Sorry about that. Sorry, I have a new computer and it's really playing tricks on me. Okay, I'm not gonna share with sound, it's not working. But anyways, you can get from the subtitles now because he's speaking in Spanish.
Yes, we can do that.
Sorry about that. So yeah, it's a problem of really markets, you know, which for me it's a really interesting topic because it's totally a social like a speculative thing, something that doesn't really exist, you know. So in summary, you know, this change to this form of agriculture that had nothing to do there caused a total soil devastation. And the video that you see there, it's during the rainy season, but this is what it looks like in the dry season. This used to be a cornfield, by the way, where this woman is walking. So yes, it's you know, I mean, it can only be described as an ecocide, what happened in Tonawixla. And so for me, it's really interesting to see how global market changes can affect subsistence farmers with these devastating ecological and social consequences. This is another clip. I'm sorry you won't hear the sound, but this is her clip. This is Esperanza, which is one of the girls that works in the workshop in the studio. And she's talking about migration. Two of her brothers migrated to the United States because they couldn't grow anything else in Tonawixla, and they died crossing. So this is also the reality of most of the village of Tonawixla. It's become essentially a ghost town where most young people have migrated, and it's become a town of women because most of the men are working in the fields in the United States. So it's also really interesting to see how this kind of global market change can make a total switch of migration where we lose really skilled farmers to go and work in the United States because we make their villages where they come from totally unprofitable or totally unlivable. So for me, the project is also about humanizing migration. The majority of indigenous rural migrants are not escaping violence, and they are certainly not chasing the American millionaire dream. You know, none of these people want to have a Lamborghini. For me, it's more like they're also not escaping violence. That's another cliche that gets thrown around a lot in the States. For me, it's more like they are rather victims of a globalized system, a corporate violence, which is incompatible with their traditional lifestyle. So my challenge was, how can we bring corn back without following the conventional model of extracting heirloom grain from communities to sell to the highest bidder in upscale restaurants? Because this is really a phenomenon that you're seeing more and more. Heirloom corn is becoming commodified, and you have more and more companies that are bringing corn either to Mexico City or to New York or to all of these really super fancy restaurants. But what about the communities? They're getting rid of all their corn, you know, and they're eating really badly. So my challenge was, yeah, how do you do something adding value without the grain? And for me, it came through the leaves. The leaves are these wonderful, colorful leaves that also make the corn very special. And with these leaves, I created a new material. So it's similar to a wood veneer. It's a veneering material, a decorative surfacing material. I was very inspired by marquetry that I saw in many European museums, because marquetry is a way of using very precious woods, normally hardwoods, tropical woods, to create just details in furniture. You're never going to get like a whole sheet of veneer. It's little pieces. And especially when I was starting my project, you know, these leaves were very precious because we were reintroducing these grains and we didn't have a lot of material. So marquetry became the technique of choice. And it's by cutting all of these tiny little pieces and assembling together that you have continuous surfaces. And with that, we make everything from small objects to big pieces of furniture, to even modular systems that can be applied in interiors to cover whole walls and make whole interiors. They have acoustic properties, and obviously they're very decorative. And by the way, I mean, just to make it super, super clear, we don't dye them or paint them in any way. This is how they grow from the plant. So it's more of a, I mean, I always see it as opening a present. Every time we open a cob of corn, see what colors you're gonna get. And it's more of a curation and pairing of what color works next to the next. But it's totally something that I don't get to control. It comes from nature. So for me, the big challenge, you know, once I had these samples and once I had these first pieces of furniture, the challenge was, how do you create a working system? And for me, the solution was to combine forces. So it was me as a designer, the world's largest seed bank specializing on corn grain, which in Texcoco in Mexico, and this indigenous community of Tonawixla. And so how does the project work? Well, we've created a new source of revenue with the husks. We incentivize farmers to reintroduce native corn by relieving them from the pressures of market demand for cheaper industrial grain. And because now it's a town of women, we have to create new sources of employment that didn't exist before, aimed just as women. So it allows local women to have flexible employment and to start reverting these migration patterns for the next generation. For me, it's extremely important to work with women because women are the translators of these messages to the next generation. They're the educators. They're the heads of family in this particular village because all the men are gone. So it's important to focus on women as well. So the results of the project so far is that we've reintroduced 8 varieties of corn that was previously wiped out from the area. This is through the partnership with the seed bank. We've created our own seed bank as well. We are, you know, doing programs and training programs with the few young people that are left in the village. But I think one of the most satisfactory achievements that we've had for the project is that we have created a return to the milpa system. So most of the farmers in the village that are now involved in the project, which is most of the farmers in the village, are now planting the traditional way again. And for me, it's really important to see how design has this ability to create value. So just roughly, you know, some rough economics, 1 square meter of totomoxle created in our community workshop generates as much revenue as 1.5 tons of grain, you know, 1,500 kilos of grain, while only using a few cobs. So it's just such a massive added value that this offers a financial independence from a market in which traditional farmers always lose. The milpa system will never be as productive in terms of weight as an industrial plantation using chemicals. So you have to kind of flip it on its head and create revenue in some other way. And for me, you know, it's also been about creating an infrastructure within their village. It's not about taking all of these resources away from the village, but creating the employment right there. So I have a strict rule as a designer, as a Mexican designer, to never work with artisans. I never, ever, ever want to work with an existing artisan community. For me, the challenge is to do something that is truly innovative and to create a new craft that didn't exist there before and a new generation of craftspeople. And so a lot of the design process has been actually creating the tools for a lot of these people to come and get educated in our technique, and within 2 or 3 days to be able to produce with the same quality results as someone that has been there for years. And that has been a real challenge of design. It's designing protocols, it's designing tools, it's designing a methodology. So for me, you know, when I was in school in St. Jose Martins, we always got pummeled about design thinking, design thinking, design thinking. For me, design thinking was always about really urban design thinking. So what about starting to think about rural design thinking? And for me, if you are someone that is not from a rural community and you want to start doing rural design thinking, you have to move to the countryside and you have to be there. And so, for example, the image on your right, I don't know if you're right or left, but this is a little contraption that we've made because I noticed that, you know, they were taking forever to cut the bottom part of the corn to separate the leaves with these little knives, and they were going blunt all the time. So we created this sort of circular blade that you put the corn in and you just, you know, move it like that. And that gives you a really clean cut. We take much more advantage of the leaves. And this is a little innovation that I think has really helped us with production, but it would have been something that I would have never arrived to if I hadn't been personally involved with every single harvest for the past 8 years. So a big part of the project is also to encourage families to be involved in every step of the production chain. And it's also about providing hope for returning migrants so they can see a future for the community and their traditions. You know, there's a lot of designers working with migrants, but it's usually arriving migrants. But what about returning migrants? You know, you have a lot of these families that during the pandemic were working in restaurants, as washing dishes or working in the fields or whatever. And there was no furlough, there was no social guarantees for undocumented migrants. So a lot of them had no choice but to come back to Mexico. So how do you capture those returning migrants, and how do you create a system where they can see a future in their community again? So, you know, there's probably people from all over the world watching this, and my question would be, why does Tonawixla matter? Why would you be interested in what happens to this little village in Mexico? And you should all be very concerned about this. And you should all be very interested in what we're doing, because this is a graph that I found in National Geographic that shows the complete depletion of diversity in agricultural crops in the past century. You know, we've lost close to 90% of the diversity of food that we used to eat 100 years ago. So if you go to a supermarket, you might be thinking, oh, well, this is like a total abundance. You know, I can get all sorts of fruits and vegetables in one place. No, what you're looking at is a total desert of diversity. You only get one, maybe two choices per food stock, and there's literally hundreds of them, or there used to be hundreds of them. So why does seed keeping in Tonawixla and the work that we're doing is important? Well, there might not be the most productive seeds, but they are very drought resistant. They can grow basically on sand. They might be part of the arsenal of solutions that we might need for the climate challenges that lay ahead. As the world gets hotter and hotter, these desertic varieties of corn might be the solution for a lot of famine in the future. So I'm going to jump to the second part of my presentation. I'm going to go really quick. I'm going to talk about agaves. And the agave for me is the magical plant. So this is a video. Just focus on the little narration. And their leaves are just thrown away, which is a shame because you can make fibers from them. It's actually quite simple. You just have to beat and scrape the leaves. When the fibers are washed and dry, they turn to a lovely blonde color. These fibers are called sisal, and for centuries they were considered the best material for making ropes and fishing nets. But unfortunately, the invention of plastics put most sisal growers out of business. It's hard to find raw sisal nowadays. I personally like to leave the fibers loose because they really feel like hair. And I actually sometimes like to call it vegan horsehair. So this is the material. This is how I harvest it. And I really became obsessed with it. And these are some of the pieces that I made with them, you know. So for me, the material is always what guides the principles of design. You know, something that looks like hair wants to behave like hair. When have you ever seen a square dog? You know, animals are round, animals are voluminous. So these animalistic shapes are the ones that fit the aesthetics of the hair the best way. And so my design process is always really focusing on what the material can do, what's the best shapes for that material, and eventually I design. So this is one of my kind of best-selling pieces, which is called the dog bench. I also make dog benches in colored versions, which are dye with cochineal, which, you know, we've learned from our previous exhibitor as well. Cochineal is this insect. I mean, I could speak about cochineal for hours, but I like to keep a logical way of working with it. You're not going to dye this supernatural fiber with a commercial, you know, synthetic dye. So for me, it's really about being thorough with all the decisions. If you start with natural materials, you know, dye them with natural materials. And, you know, I've done everything from really big installations. For example, this was in Art Basel 2019 in Miami. These were these funny sloths that were hanging all over the design district in Miami. I like to make characters, you know, I'm very inspired and also like the animistic characters in a lot of traditional dances, not only in Mexico, but all over the world. But then I kind of bring it back always to furniture, you know. So this is an example of a cabinet that is furry on the outside. We made the handles, for example, you know, in the shape of agave leaves. So there's a visual storytelling of where the material comes from. And I'm still a designer, you know, I still work in the computer. I still use things like a CNC machine that I have in my studio to cuddle the parts. The bones are still done in a very technological way, but my way of working is always trying to hide technology and to hide it through craft. So it's truly a merge between technology and craft. And these are some short clips of how we work. Actually, this girl Jenica is from the Design Academy Eindhoven. So my studio is very international. It's in Mexico City, but it's filled with people from all over the world, filled with people from the village. It's a place of encounters of people from all of these different backgrounds. So a lot of my furry technique is employing, for example, latch hooking, which is usually this kind of like grandma craft, you know, to make little bath rugs. So we use the same hooks, and we're always trying to look for our own solutions. So as you can see, it's not the kind of craft that you would get in a little village that, you know, weaves baskets. So we try to make our own techniques. These are the handles I was talking about. And the thing is, this also ties with the issue of Tonawixla. This is a project that we're also implementing in Tonawixla. And I'm going to talk you through this short video. So remember the eroded fields where nothing grows anymore. What we've been doing is looking at the water and how to retain the water to stop the erosion. So these are all 3D renderings of these mountains. And this is a map of how the water flows. If there's no plants holding the water just flows. So what we've been doing is creating these terraces to create these physical barriers to hold the water. And at the edge of each of these barriers, we plant agaves. So the agaves start shooting the roots onto the few soil that we can get. And they can basically grow on rocks. When the agaves start to retain that soil, you start to create a barrier, a green barrier. And so we've planted thousands and thousands of agaves, actually much more than 45,000 by now. And this is it. This is a model of how we do it. It's creating plant barriers essentially. The water gets stopped, it starts to get filtered, it's filling out the wells. And agaves are pioneering plants. So they start to invite other plants to start regenerating the whole mountain. And so yes, it might seem strange to call this, but what we're doing is regeneration. We are using the most suitable local plant to reforest in an area where a tree will never grow. And these are some drone footages to show you the real scale of the project. I mean, we're working at the scale of a whole mountain, close to 200 hectares. It's huge. And these are, the first plants that are starting to come back. So yeah, we've covered loads and loads of hectares. And it's something that for me, it's a lifelong project. It's something that is just starting for me, even though we started 8 years ago. And it's something that is feeding back to the corn project, is feeding back to the Agave project, the same community, basically planting back their agaves, planting back their corns, and creating a new situation where they can live again from their land, which is what they took away from them. They've never been rich people, but they've always been land rich. And so if you take the ability for them to feed themselves out of their own land, that's when things go really bad. So that's what we're trying to repair. We're starting to repair both the environment and the community. So I'm going to jump closely to conclusions. For me, Indigenous communities must be included in sustainability policy-making decisions. Why? Because they are the least responsible for climate change, yet they are the first ones to suffer from it. They are victims of the negative effects of globalization while being excluded from its advantages. I mean, they get all the plastic, they get all the Coca-Colas, they get all the financial inequality, and they get none of the advantages that we get to live off as part of a global community. So for me, one of the biggest milestones of the project as well was to be invited to the World Economic Forum in its 50th anniversary. This was in January 2020, right before the pandemic. And I told the organizers, well, I'm happy to go and speak about the project, but I am not Indigenous, and I always feel a bit weird speaking on behalf of Indigenous people. So why don't you bring Delfino, and why don't you bring Nicolas? And they did. And so I think it was a very cathartic experience, because it was one of the first times that they got really, really listened to at probably one of the biggest platforms you could ever be speaking to. And you had everything from, Donald Trump to Greta Thunberg within the same conference. And somewhere in the mix, there were Delfino and Nicolas, who got to speak and who got to explain some of the challenges that they are living in as Indigenous people in this globalized world. Nothing much came out of it in terms of support from Davos or anything, but I think it was a major confidence boost for the village as a whole. It was a really tipping point where so many more families joined the project. So many people got so much energy during the pandemic. And I think it's also about that. It's about returning self-confidence. These are people that have been told for generations and generations that they are, backwards, that their traditional way of system is unprogressive. And I think this kind of things is what returns them their confidence. So for me, the goal is not sustainability, but regeneration. I think we've gone too far. It's not about sustaining the current state. It's about improving the wealth of resources that we have. We can't solve the climate crisis without addressing the inequality crisis. I think things won't change if the only way out of extreme poverty is to decimate natural resources. I mean, if you can't get education for your kids or housing or clothing, but you can if you go and cut down the forest behind your house, you will do it. I will do it. Anyone would do it. So it's about narrowing that inequality gap if we want to focus on preserving our ecosystems. And I think we can't do that without addressing the ghost of our colonial past. Designers can play a major role in proposing radical new systems that create new economies that are environmentally sound without the need of big investment or expensive technology. This whole project was started basically with no money, and it was just getting the community to participate and to exercise their already very strong community organizing structures. So yes, for me, the environmental crisis is a man-made crisis. And I think, there are a lot of these new concepts of like, oh, should we abandon the idea of human-centered design? Should we focus on nature-centered design? I don't think we should abandon human-centered design. I think we just need to diversify who we are designing for, and focus more on the needs of these people that are not necessarily, you know, within urban context and within kind of like the capitalist system. Thank you for listening. I just think, as a final thought, you know, saying that this is the World Hope Forum, I am hopeful. I am hopeful, and I am proud from being from a country that has maintained traditions alive. I am hopeful that we are redefining what progress means. I am hopeful because we are starting to heal the wounds of our dark past. And I am hopeful because we have more and more young people tracing a new path where repair trumps profit. So I am hopeful in general. Thank you.
Fernando,
Thank you.
this is so wonderful. Thank you for all the hope and all the points of hope. It has been a very interesting journey. As always, you know, at the end, you're almost close to tears because it's accumulating all this knowledge and all this wisdom and this vision. But I have not only once thought, actually, that it felt like I was, the whole evening, for me, it's evening, for you, it's morning, the whole evening, I felt I was going to school because I learned so much from everybody. Everybody was teaching in one way or another, how to handle things, how to take problems by the neck, you know, and start solving. And so maybe Mexico should become the world school, the world school of how to handle these things, because we haven't seen, you know, so accumulated, so densely as today, you know, that all of you have your solutions for education, for the farmers, for the fashion, you know, for making the books, for going to weapons and so on. It's super amazing, is that it's been classes and classes and classes of sort of, how can you do this? Why don't you do it? Start doing this. It's insane. It's mind-blowing. And yeah, I think, you know, that with the World Hope Forum now getting more mature, we are actually really sensing that there is hope. We are really sensing that there is the possibility for change, that there is the possibility, as soon as we will have the critical mass to make this happen, it will happen. So I'm super grateful. Also, I think Philip would be enormously grateful for everything, for all the speakers, for Carla being such a great, amazing curator. This is all your friends. So you live in a very nice world, I must say. Ragnar, thank you so much also for helping us through all the problems, as always. You know, we don't care, nobody cares. Our audience is very patient. I think that everybody has been super, super enthusiastic and involved, and there's just thank you notes, you know, all the time for everybody. So it's been a fantastic forum. Let's get together in 2 years to see, you know, how we catch up. And yes, let's start all to become more hopeful. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much, Lee, and everyone involved. And I just want to finish saying something that Doris taught me, and it's in Spanish. I don't know if it's going to translate as beautifully as it says in Spanish. And it says, propuesta, no protesta, that you have to propose and not only talk about it. So thank you, Lee.
Thank you, exactly. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Gracias.